So I'm going to say thank you very, very much to Jessica Yellin for agreeing to chat with me. And I think I'm trying to remember how long ago it was that I last saw you, but it might be over 10 years ago.
I think it's more than a decade. We were in New York City and I don't remember what you were working on, but you're always uncovering something that everybody wants the dish on. So I was talking to Vicky and everyone's like, find out what she knows about X. And I can't remember what it was, but you're always in the know.
Well, yeah, I don't know what that says about me. I don't know. I think I probably have a populist sensibility when it comes to the news. And I think you were working at CNN, and and years later I followed in your footsteps and learned a bit more about TV news than I probably knew then. But Jessica, so I want to ask you about news, not noise, and how you do it. Because I was sitting at my desk today feeling slightly sick with all the, uncertainty around what's really going on in the Middle East and Iran. And, I have good sources because I wrote a book on Jared Kushner and I'm a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. I plugged into the panel they had. But to be honest, the talk about news, news, not noise. It was all noise. Nobody at the end of the day really seems to really know what's really going on. What do you do on days like this?
So my general thesis is that part of the challenge of understanding the news is having some of the backstory, like understanding how we got to this point and what the key issues are. And so many people jump in with an opinion when they've scratched the tiniest bit of the surface. We're overwhelmed with information. We're inundated with stuff that is like screaming and loud and noisy, and everybody's so quickly opinionated. So my general approach is to slow it down and to say, basically, if you have an extremely strong opinion on either side, this is not for you. You can go have your opinions, but we're here to actually get a little bit more information. And so I slowed it down. Like, I didn't book the sexiest guest on earth. Well, he's going to be offended. He is very attractive person. I didn't mean in that way, but I mean like the biggest name on earth. I booked somebody who's a really substantive, thoughtful person who knows this region inside and out and can explain the strongest argument for those military strikes, the strongest argument against, what a deal might look like. Sort of, let's breathe into this moment and understand a little more.
Yes. And without, wishing to ruin things for your viewers, what are you thinking? I mean, now, right, there's been breaking news just in the last hour. Okay. Now Trump is saying there's going to be a ceasefire. Hasn't been confirmed by either Israel or Iran. I mean, are you already thinking, what are you going to do tomorrow, or will you wait for tomorrow to come?
Oh, you have to wait for tomorrow to come, because by the time, the chance that Trump was able to single-handedly secure a lasting peace with Iran after decades of an inability to do that in just hours after a bombing is quite slim. So my guess is this is, it's either a negotiating tactic or it's a sort of announcement of an intention to consider moving toward conversations that lead to negotiations. I don't think they have a deal. And so tomorrow we'll be in another place, and you can't get ahead of it. But that's why having enough understanding of sort of the region and how things work there helps. Like, as soon as he made that announcement that we have a ceasefire, I knew immediately to be like, whoa, it's not, there's more to, they don't have an actual ceasefire. There's more to this. Because the region. So you need a little bit of history and backstory to understand what's going on today.
And because you were a White House reporter, big White House reporter for CNN, the other thing that's obviously so difficult covering this particular White House is it's so lean, right? I mean, that you always have that sort of the problem of, if you want access, do you have to sort of suck up, or how do you deal with trying to report on this this particular administration, because it's different from the last Trump administration, right? Because it is just a few people in a room.
I don't actually think there are a lot of people who cover the personalities in the building and what is Trump thinking now and what are his aides planning next. And that's a full-time job. It's time
Yeah.
consuming. You have to work those personalities. I don't see my role as doing that. My role is helping people to make sense of, based on what they're doing, what's really going to happen in the country. Based on what's happening there, what does this mean for your life? I think what a lot of news doesn't address as well as we should is, how does this translate to you at home?
Right.
And I think, for legitimate reasons, people struggle with it, right? You got to cover the buildings. You got to do the decision maker level news.
Yeah, yeah.
Resources are slim. But I also, a lot of what's actually happening in the country isn't really that reflected, certainly on TV news and in a lot of the coverage right now. And so part of it is reflecting back to the audience how this impacts them. For example, let me ground this. As soon as the Iran strikes were announced, what started trending all over social media, what are the messages I got? Are my kids getting drafted? I
Really?
dated with people, and I have so many people contacting me. The teenagers and 20-somethings are convinced they're getting drafted. Now, that is not something anybody in Washington would ever think to cover because it's so improbable. We have a voluntary military now. It's our thesis that it's preferable to have an all-voluntary military. Like, why? But this is what's going around. So being responsive to those concerns and hearing what they are and explaining, no, a draft is extremely unlikely for all these many reasons, is also news. It's helping people understand what's happening out there in a way that relates to their lives and what their concerns are.
Hmm.
It's not all I covered, but it's
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, it's fascinating. So walk me back because, um, I love when you left CNN, you completely left for a bit, right? And you wrote a novel.
I did, yes.
Which I would love to
Oh,
do
yeah.
that. And
I don't recommend it.
why?
Oh, it's just like it's so you get lost. I got lost in the process. So I'd never written a novel, so I didn't know. You're sort of, you swim halfway out to the sea and you're like, should I give up? Should I keep going?
Right. But are you glad you did it?
I am. I always wanted to write a novel. And so that's done.
That's done. And it's not, I mean, a very, very different existence. I mean, you're used to being out talking to people and then suddenly you're by yourself.
Yes. And it was really fun to be able to sort of fictionalize certain themes and things I've always wanted to like explain and share. And it was funny. And I cover war and politics, so I don't get to be light that often. And so it was another side of my personality. And I think it's funny. It's really about the insanity of working inside, nonstop round the clock news as a woman who's constantly
Yeah.
judged for her hair.
Yes, I know you do talk about. I know which I can completely relate to because actually,
Did you go
I'm
through
always
that too? Yeah.
yes, and actually, even now when when I'm looking at my these video chats and everything else, I'm always like, oh, what's going on with your hair for
I
some
know.
reason.
We're
Um,
trained to, critique our own hair.
I know. Um, but then but then you come out of that and it's 2019, right? So we're first Trump administration, and I guess we're just pre-COVID.
Yeah.
So what? I mean, it just seems to sort of. I mean, you start News Not Noise on Instagram. So what was that about?
That's the best way to ask that. Like, what exactly what were you thinking? So, okay, I'll take you back for a beat, which is when I was a political correspondent, I was frequently interviewing undecided voters. This is still when I was in TV news. And overwhelmingly in that time, they were women. Remember, soccer moms.
Yeah.
And, these were people who couldn't decide who they were going to vote for. a month, just weeks before the election. And in Washington, everyone's, the point of view is these people don't care about politics. They're disengaged. That's why they're not paying attention. That's why they haven't made up their mind. But I'd be out there interviewing these women and they would go like this. They would say, the news, I can't listen to it. And I'd say, why? And they'd say, all you do is you highlight the crises, you give me a panic attack, and then you go to commercial break. You get me hysterical and you give me no answers and you leave me hanging. I'd rather watch the crime channel, they'd say.
Yeah.
At least they have a resolution. That's a quote I would
Right.
hear over and over. And so I realized there's this audience, and they would take out a notepad and they'd say, I want to know, this person said that. Are they going to raise my taxes? This person said that. What are they going to do? And they weren't uninformed. They weren't getting the information they needed. And
Right.
as a result, they were disengaged from the political process, from like civic action, from all sorts of things. And I had this thesis that if we can change how we're communicating, we can engage some of these people. And that's a whole other audience. At the time, so fast forward, when I'm finishing my book, it's 2018. Already Facebook had been sort of trashed because of Cambridge Analytica and the way they were compromised in the election. But Instagram was still like this innocent space where people were posting vacation pics and their like dinner.
Yeah.
And I thought, and it was very female, like the
Right.
audience skewed female. And so I thought this could be a good place to just try some stuff. I'd been pitching like news done differently and nobody was buying in. I was saying the news was broken and people are like, you're crazy.
You were
Now
saying
they're
this
saying
sort of to networks, to traditional news networks.
producers, investors, anybody, would you back me to start a news business, all these things, right? And everyone's like, you don't know what you're talking about. The news is broken. The news is fine. And so I decided I have to like see if there's a thing here. And I picked up my phone. It was summer of 2018. It was right before right during the Kavanaugh hearings. And I covered Capitol Hill in the White House. And I started explaining, here's what happened today, but here's what it's really about. And if you're a survivor, this might be triggering. Here's a place you can call. So it was like short distilled news with a little bit of depth and background and some empathy. And I made 3-minute videos, posted them on Instagram. It was before Instagram supported video, so I had to hack the
Right.
system.
Wow.
And I ended up being one of the first people to start doing these vertical short news videos. Meta used my account, took my videos, and went to newsrooms around the globe to say, this is how to do news on social media. So I helped start, for better or worse, I helped start this moment in, distributed news reporting on social. And what I ultimately found, and I'll wrap it up, is I built an audience organically. I don't spend to grow, but that there is an audience that wants truthful information. And so many of our conversations about this are filled with this sort of sneering skepticism that the truth is dead and there's no audience for it. It's not true. What we need are new tools, new infrastructure, and support to get that kind of trusted information, to resource it and get it out to the audience. There's an audience that still wants it.
Is your audience still primarily women?
On Instagram, it skews heavily female. And that's in part because I grew because a bunch of celebrities found me early and told people to
Right.
follow me, and they were all women. And so it grew women, like that. But it's more gender balanced on Substack. But yeah, we skew female.
And then how do you decide, right? Because obviously this last weekend, it's been Iran, 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 but before, immigration is something, how do immigration is a big topic, but when you were talking just now, I thought, Trump's big, beautiful bill, for example, was something that was everywhere in the headlines. And then, in fact, to your point, stories they're on and they're shrill and then they vanish. And
Yeah.
obviously that bill is now going through the Senate. But it's kind of buried right in the news. But if you're you and you're trying to keep, sort of tell the story with its beginning, its middle, and its end without the shrill exclamation mark, how do you decide your topics?
So I always say the best part of my job is I get to decide every day what counts as news. And the worst part of my job is I have to decide every day what counts as news.
Right.
So it's a plus and a minus. You brought up the perfect point. So that's one of those topics that can seem unsexy and get buried. And so it's important to keep covering it. The reality is, I'm on every day, whether
Yeah.
I'm not always on camera, but I'm posting every day. We do our newsletter. So all those things, I mean, those are the three topics really: ICE, deportations, and the cuts in the big beautiful bill. We always circle back to those, and the challenge is, how do we make it relevant to you? I do not care like what the bird rule is or the parliamentarian has done and why is not important, except that it means that food stamps aren't getting cut for this category of person, right? That's the crucial thing that I think we often miss is and I mean like, Beltway media often gets so into process that it doesn't feel like this stuff relates to you out there in the audience. And
Mm.
it so relates. Like that's all it's about. It's changing your life. And so it's inverting that. How do we find the stories that are relevant to you that are happening in Washington and tell them in ways you get?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So it's really about the impact all the time, the impact, impact, impact.
Do you think you work harder now than you did back in the days covering the White House for CNN? I mean, the mind boggles, but I'm very what's your answer?
Such a good question. In terms of pure hours, they're probably comparable. Um, the difference is that, I mean, it's nonstop work. You're a content, it's just
Yeah.
nonstop. And it's like the minute you're not on because I was in the emergency room 2 weeks ago and people were like, where are
Yeah.
you? I'm like, I'm having a health crisis. Um, and they didn't have Wi-Fi in there, so it was probably good for me.
Right. Yeah. You were forced to take a beat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, it's different. I'm home with my dog and I get to report and whatever.
And I mean, one of the things that I feel, I mean, my Substack is tiny, compared to yours, but there is something about it's mine. I mean, it's you're not working crazy hours for somebody else. You're doing this for you and for the community that you have built
Right.
up and that you have a dialogue with. And I think that's very, to me, that feels, very meaningful.
Yeah, it's different.
Um,
And isn't it nice to be in conversation with the people, like, that you
yes.
hear from them? I'm sure you must hear from people ask, "We wanna know more about this," and you're like, "Oh, I didn't know that would be what fascinates you."
Oh, yes. I mean, and people give me feedback, which, and because also what I haven't yet managed to do is really, sort of make a niche beat on my Substack. I tend to just, and I'm interested in absolutely everything. And so I'm sure my followers find it all a bit, um, schizophrenic, but it is very helpful then when, I randomly decided that I would review all the shows on Broadway, which is not because, I love Broadway. I'm an English lit major, but this is not, Vicky Ward's stable of Jeffrey Epstein and corruption in Washington,
Right.
etc. And, I got the most incredible feedback, sort of, to the point that I'm thinking one day when I had time that I would do a sort of weekend culture column. But I would never have had the confidence to do that if I hadn't had the reaction that I had. And I think the other thing that I struggle with was I had to take a sabbatical from my Substack because I was just finishing this book that I have coming out, and I've now already signed another book that is
What's the
going to be
next
it.
book?
Well,
Not allowed to
it
say?
hasn't been announced yet, but put it
Okay.
this way, it is very, very, very topical.
Oh,
It's the one that's coming up is obviously skewed to there's a big trial of the guy
Yeah.
on trial for the Idaho murders. There's going to be, use your imagination, there's going to be another huge trial next year for something that's very much in the zeitgeist. And that is what the next book will be on. But I do not want to desert, at this point, desert my um, Substack audience. So the challenge is really for me to figure out how to give people content that's meaningful and quality and write a book. And I'm trying to figure it out.
Can you do a Substack on the experience of writing the book and what you're working out as you're writing
You
it?
know, I think, well, so it'll be interesting. The Idaho 4 book, when we finish at the end, it says it's not over. There's more to come. And what we're going to, because obviously the trial hasn't happened. And so we will then add extra chapters for the paperback. But I think that what we will do on the I will use my Substack for the 3 months as the trial goes on. And part of that will then be reflected in the next chapters. But you raise an interesting point. It would be great if I was able for the next book to sort of research in public. The problem is that the value, obviously, of deep dive investigative journalism is that when people that it surprises people to some degree.
Right.
So when they read the book, because it's taken me a year or longer to do, they will learn things about a story they thought they knew all about, and in fact they really didn't. So I haven't figured out how to do that kind of investigative deep dive journalism with the kind of transparency
Uh-huh.
that Substack would require, because as there's a lot of talking to people very off record, a lot of talking to people on background, and that you can't do.
What about the
Um,
color, like the details that don't go in the book? The random conversation you have at the checkout counter at the cafe with somebody locally who gives you
yes,
insight into culture that's not gonna go in the book.
I think once the next book is announced, that's exactly the kind of thing
Okay.
that I think.
So
Um, yes, I mean,
can I
it's
ask
just
you a
not.
question?
Yeah,
Why hasn't that trial this is about the Idaho murders, the college
yes,
students who why hasn't that trial happened? Don't we the man who was arrested, it's been years already.
yes. It will be nearly 3 years when that trial. It's scheduled to start on August the 11th, and our book comes out on July the 14th. And actually, the judge has already been um, sort of complaining, um, about the fact that there's so much media interest and talked about the book. And my response to that is, that if Sean Coombs can get they can convene a jury for Sean Coombs in New York and he can get a fair trial, I think so can Brian Koberger. I mean, that it's been delayed and delayed. He waived his right to a preliminary hearing the first year. Then because the murders happened in this tiny city of Moscow, they ended up moving um, the venue to Boise, Idaho, which is a huge hassle, by the way, for the victims' families. And on the grounds that, he needed to be further away from Moscow to get a fair hearing. And, I personally have become very close to two of the four victims' families, and I feel deeply empathetic for their frustration with this whole process. And I didn't know, Jessica, till I reported this book, that actually the families of murder victims really have very few rights. I mean, they know not much more than the rest of us about what happened to their kids and why. So to have waited 3 years for their day in court, it reflects that something needs reforming in our justice system, I have to say. Um, so I think it will be very, very good for this trial um,
Just yeah,
to start. Yeah.
and I'm excited to read your book. Will the trial be televised?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes. So the trial will be televised. It's a very small courtroom, and I will be there for bits of it. I I mean, this book is personal. I mean, I wrote it with James Patterson, who, obviously writes primarily fiction. And, we just, at the beginning of it, we sort of said, we want to feel, we don't want to feel like this is a New York Times article and that I'm flying at 40,000 feet. We want the readers to feel like you're there in Moscow, that, you really knew Xana, Kaylee, Maddie, and Ethan, the four kids. You were in their world. You're in the world of their families. You're in the world of the police chief. And so, as a result, it's very personal. And the people I got to know very well, I don't really think of as sources at this point. I think of them as friends. And there's one young woman in particular who was Xana Kernodle's best friend, who's got to testify, and she has asked for me to be in the courtroom so that she can look at me and not at Brian Coburg. So I will obviously be there, but this book is different for me. I'm not flying at 40,000 feet, and I'm not sort of being dispassionate because I got to be very emotionally involved. My sons are the same age as these kids, which is sort of why I wanted to do it. And I was, I looked at Brian Koberger, I will say this, and thought, why would someone who's overcome heroin addiction and poverty and been given the chance of a lifetime to go study criminology PhD how does that person then wind up as a suspect in a mass homicide? So and he was in his 20s too. So, I'm a little bit a sort of psychological sleuth here.
Oh,
But
I
it was
can't wait to read. Yeah.
Well, July the 14th, the Idaho 4.
And are you covering Diddy now?
I have been. So actually, this is one thing I've really begun to enjoy. Because I have covered a lot of trials, and I always think that they are something that doesn't get reflected properly in the news, because every time you sit through a trial, there's extraordinary tension and drama. I mean, it's like going to a Broadway show, but with much greater stakes. And when I started my Substack, it was because I was covering the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, and I was in court every day. And I realized that there was actually a real gap in the market. People really wanted to read, what happened. And I started to grade each of the lawyers' performances, and I noticed the prosecutors and the defense attorneys, their parents started to comment on what I was writing. And so, and now, I can't be in every courtroom. But I now do a weekly show with Adam Klasfeld, who is in a lot of different courtrooms, and he has been in the Diddy trial. He's also been in the Kilmar Abrego Garcia trial. So through him, he brings us up to date, and I get to ask questions. And so, I mean, I know that the big question around the Diddy trial is not about whether he was a sexual abuser, which his defense team has said absolutely, yes, he is, but that's not what's at stake. It's a racketeering case. So, and whether or not the government have made their case for that, but it's basically, was he running a RICO enterprise? So was he using his business basically to do that? And what sex trafficking is the other thing. So it will be very interesting to see whether they're able, to win that. I mean, the prosecution hasn't yet wrapped up, but it's the same Maureen Comey, James Comey's daughter, who cut her teeth on the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, is leading the prosecution on this one. So that is kind of interesting.
Yeah. Small world.
Yeah. So what have I not asked you that I should? what do you think about the Ninth Circuit appeal? That is something that Adam and I have talked about over the National Guard in California, because I know you've done quite a lot of reporting on this.
It's hard. This is one where it's hard to separate as a journalist, I found it surprising. And as a resident of Los Angeles, I found it surprising.
Right.
But I can see the argument that you can't deny the president his right and ability to call up the guard. The reality on the ground is there was LA. I've seen more unrest in LA with no law enforcement than I saw during those protests when there was a police presence. The idea that the guard was needed here is wild. It's not real. And, it's just we're living in one of those worlds where you create enough of a narrative and you can even make the case in court that a thing that wasn't happening was happening. So I, hope that the state of California is appealing and will, maybe there will be new standards set for under what conditions a president may overrule a governor, or a certain, level needs to be reached. We are off, I always say we're off the timeline. I don't know what's going on. What is happening? This is it's not the standard and the way, it's not how the system's been run before.
No.
So the way I tend to think about what we're going through is a lot hasn't been working. As you're in any niche we look into, you'll unpeel it and say something needs reforming here. And sometimes you just need a shock to the system to force that reform. And, we're definitely getting our shock. And maybe on the other side of this, there's a real push for systemic change, which we
Although I will tell you, so I mean, because I've spent quite a lot of time talking with Adam, but also with Andrew Weissman. And before I did the Idaho book, believe it or not, I spent a lot of time. I made a podcast series about the Federalist Society. So
wow.
Yale Law School's relationship to the Supreme Court, but actually on the conservative side.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think, is interesting is actually how the courts, and it's not perfect, but the courts so far are holding.
Mostly. Today the Supreme Court ruled that the U.S. can deport criminal undocumented people to third countries, including South Sudan, which I couldn't have guessed that that's how they'd rule, and I don't know what to make of that.
Yes, that's exactly the example I would have cited as being like the aberration, because yes, I mean that's extraordinary. And Adam and I are going to talk about that tomorrow afternoon. Actually, I mean, no, I mean that is extraordinary. But I mean, we have three branches of government, and I think that the courts are doing a better job than Congress right now.
Low bar, but yes. And somebody said to me, Leonard Leo might save the republic because all the Trump judges that he recommended I'm going to get, strung up for saying that, but all the Trump judges that they put forward in the first term have actually been quite.
Yes.
They've hewn to the Constitution. They might be originalists, but that's working right now.
That's exactly right. People think that they're conservatives. Actually, they're primarily Catholic. They're very
whole conversation.
It's a whole other conversation, Jessica. Listen, you were so nice to do this, and I promise I would only take 30 minutes of your time. But it's really, really been a pleasure to catch up with you.
It's so nice to talk to you. And when your book comes out, I'd love to have a conversation about the trial and the case and all that.
No, please. I would love to do that. It's as you can tell, this one is a passion project.
Yeah. And Leonard Leo another time. That'd be interesting.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I have a lot to say about that.
Okay. Well, congratulations on all of it. And it's so lovely to see you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
See you. Bye.